Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about climate change communication. Now, we have already talked about how climate change is a serious problem and also a bit about how it's a controversial question within our society about what we're going to do about it. Now, there's a real importance for us to be able to talk with the public about these types of issues and to do so effectively, recognizing that people come from different backgrounds and have different perspectives on this issue. So this lecture is really trying to help us to think about some effective strategies for both thinking about and understanding what the public believes and also helping them to shift their perspectives towards climate change. So it will come as no surprise to anyone here that in the United States, the topic of climate change is both politicized and polarized in terms of how people tend to think about it. Now, if you look around the globe and look at different political parties around the world in other countries, it usually isn't the case that there's one party that says that climate change doesn't exist or it's not important. It's usually, you will see some differences between political parties, but it's usually more along the lines of what types of solutions they recommend or approve of. So we in the United States are facing a distinctly challenging process for talking about this issue. Now, I wouldn't be able to talk about climate change communication without bringing this up, without talking directly about Democrats and Republicans and sort of the way that perspectives align across those party divides, right? So it is something that we have to talk about, but I do want to emphasize that people come from all sorts of different backgrounds. There is diversity within both parties in terms of how people want to address things and think about things. And I don't want to oversimplify. This is almost everything I'm showing you is based on research. So it's not something that's hypothetical. It's really based upon opinion surveys about how people think about climate change. And I'm not really trying to denigrate any group per se in talking about it. More just trying to help us understand how does this work, what are the alignments of the politics around this, and how would you actually talk to different people. And as you'll see at the end, I actually do talk about the fact that although there are differences in perspectives around climate change, that there actually are effective ways of talking about across difference, and that we shouldn't give up on that as a possibility. And because we really do need to be able to talk about this, we really do need to be able to make progress on this issue. So I hope that this is interesting for you. It helps sort of talk about some of the polarization that we see. And this polarization isn't just about climate change, but it's also relevant to things like COVID-19 and other things like that. But the other thing that I want you to pay attention to as I go through this conversation is the way that you can use research and evidence to guide your communication towards more effective strategies, right? That's a really important component to what I'm talking about this, is that when we talk about hard, challenging, polarizing issues, we can actually use data and information about how people think about things to actually create better messages. So there has for a long time been a divide in terms of how Democrats and Republicans have responded to different types of environmental threats. And this is the League of Conservation Voters, where they essentially analyze political leaders based upon how they vote on environmental issues. All right. And now there's always been a difference between Republicans and Democrats, but the important thing here to note is that this difference has really accentuated. So back in the 70s to the 90s, there was a difference of roughly 20%. Right now, the voting records for Republicans and Democrats is close to around 80%, actually. It's a very, very big difference in terms of how people are voting in government. You also see this in the general public. If you look at people who are Democratic or lean Democratic versus people who are Republican and lean Republican, There is a substantially difference in how they see climate change as being a priority for the president and Congress, right? And that gap has been widening. It actually is starting to bend back towards a little bit more, coming a little bit closer in terms of people recognizing this risk. Now, it's important to note again that this divergence is relatively recent, as you saw in the two slides before and this slide. If you look at 1997, when it comes to, for example, here's just a question which asked whether or not the seriousness of global warming is exaggerated in the news. And this is looking by party, the red lines being Republican, the blue lines being Democrat. And what we find is that there is, if we look at 1997, there really wasn't such a big divide around how people thought about this then. But this really resulted in a substantial broadening and gap between the parties that we're still seeing. Now, why did this occur? Well, climate change became a political issue. So Al Gore was running for president in 2000, and it was known that he was going to be running for president in 2000. So there was awareness that he was a politician who had a very strong focus on climate change, on an environmental policy. That's something that he ran on and was very strongly supportive of. And part of political strategy is to segment the population. And one way to do that is if one member of political party, if the political party you're opposing says one thing, you then develop arguments to oppose that perspective. So essentially what happened as we went into the 2000 election, there was a deliberate effort to really pump up climate change denial and response. And this got worse and worse, and it was a response in part to Al Gore and his promotion of this. Now, Al Gore has done a lot of fantastic work around climate change, and I'm not blaming him for this, but it is sort of an explanation for how the populace has been divided. And there were a wide range of different efforts to try and undermine an understanding of climate change and to argue that it really wasn't an issue or that the science wasn't settled. Now, this has actually worked pretty well. If you look across different groups, we find that about half people think that global warming should be a high or very high priority for the President and Congress. But if you divide people out by Democrats or Republicans, Democrats it's 81% and Republicans on the whole it's 16%. If you look at liberal Democrats versus moderate/conservative Democrats versus liberal/moderate Republicans versus conservative Republicans, you'll also see a huge difference in terms of prioritization of climate change. So here's the issue. This has been an ongoing debate and partisan debate, and it's been pretty vehement. And there's been a really heavily funded misinformation campaign. Now, the problem is that most of the misinformation campaign has really revolved around whether or not the science of climate change is valid, whether there really is a change in temperature, whether there's really anything to be concerned about. And the problem is that this has really effectively undermined any sort of action. Because we're spending all of our time arguing about whether or not climate change is real while it's progressing. And if we're arguing about whether or not it's real, we're not actually even talking about what to do about it. And some of those things that we have to do about it actually involve fairly substantial structural changes, which will dramatically impact our economic and social systems. So there's a real need to pursue a shift in this conversation. And this is pretty widely recognized in climate change communication circles. Many people feel that we really need to start just treating the science as settled and to stop engaging in this back and forth about trying to continue to convince people that climate change is real. We have to stop doing that and move into a new debate. And that new debate is also going to be really hard. And that's the debate of what are we going to do about this? What sort of strategies are we going to pursue? And people from all sorts of different backgrounds are reasonably have different perspectives on how we should approach that. All right. So when we're thinking about communicating about climate change, it's helpful to understand what the public actually believes about climate change. So there's been a wide range of different research about this. And what they found is that there seems to be 5 key beliefs that seem to be really important for predicting whether or not people support action around climate change. So here's the things that tend to predict this. First off, the belief that scientists actually agree that climate change is happening. All right. The next is whether or not how certain someone is that climate change is happening. Or do they think it's unlikely, or do they think that they're really certain that it's going to happen? Do they believe that if climate change is happening, that it will actually cause harm, social, health, and otherwise, right, to our environment and to people? Then, do people believe that humans are the reason that climate change is occurring, that human action is actually doing this, that our emissions, our carbon emissions are doing this? And then finally, the belief that we actually can do something that will address climate change issues, right? So these are the 5 things that we know actually influences whether or not someone's going to actually do something about climate change and pursue this. All right, so what do we know about what the public thinks about climate change? So let me just orient you to the charts. I'm going to show you a bunch of these charts just to give you a sort of a ballpark understanding of how the public views climate change. So along the top is a question that's being asked. So here it's the estimate % of adults who think that global warming is happening. And this is 2019 data, so pretty recent data. And in parentheses there is the average for the country. So 67% for the United States thinks that global warming is happening. Okay. Now in looking at the pictures, you'll see along the side is essentially a color chart that's matching up from 0%, which is a dark blue, all the way up to 100%, which is essentially a purple, demonstrating the percentage of the population that believes that adults who think global warming is happening. And we'll see, looking at this picture, that this varies depending on what part of the country someone is in. So, for example, we see in California, where there's been tremendous fires and droughts and impacts of climate change, that there is a dark orange spot of people really thinking that global warming is happening. So there is going to be difference across different regions. So this gives us an idea of sort of the range of views that the public has. Now, if we look at Washington State, we also see that Washington State has diversity in terms of their belief about global warming happening. Although, as is noted in the previous slide, the majority of the population actually does think that it's happening. So this is good news. This is indicating to us that the public actually thinks global warming is a concern, is really occurring. And that wasn't always the case. So this is good news that people are actually recognizing this fact. Now, it's also the case that most people seem to think that global warming is affecting weather patterns, right? So that there is an impact, a direct impact of global warming on the weather that we're experiencing. Now, this has a little bit more varied response in terms of people's belief in this, but you do see generally that 59% of the US public does believe this. Generally within Washington State, there seems to be a support of this idea as well. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated, and I talked about the 5 key beliefs, that one of the major components to this is actually believing that humans cause climate change. And this is much more varied. I talked about the misinformation campaigns that have occurred. They've actually been very effective. There's a lot of the public who actually is doubtful that global warming is caused by humans. And we'll see within Washington State that we see a variety of belief in this
question. This is also similar to the questions around whether or not people believe that scientists agree that global warming is happening. A lot of the misinformation was really geared towards raising doubt about it. So very often these campaigns would pull up a scientist or two and create ads that these scientists were presenting the idea that questioning that climate change was occurring in various different ways. And they were pretty effective at doing this, at raising confusion about whether or not there was agreement. So again, we see some variety of opinions in Washington State on this as well. Now, one thing that we know is that there's an increasing number of people that actually are seeing climate change as being concerning. So here we're looking over time as compared to the previous graphs. And what we're seeing is we're pushing towards, among the public, almost half of the public believing that they've actually personally experienced the impact of global warming, right? So this is an indicator that there is a shift in the public in terms of recognizing these risks. And in addition to feeling they've experienced climate change, majority of Americans also seem to believe that extreme weather actually is a real risk that they need to be concerned about. So this is for the question of, in your opinion, over the next 10 years, how much risk does extreme weather pose to your community? And the green are moderate risk or high risk. All right. So one question is what people believe about climate change. Another one is, what are people's attitudes or feelings about climate change? Well, if you ask people whether or not they're worried about climate change, well, people actually, there is about 60% of the public who is at least somewhat worried about climate change, right? So there is concern throughout the country. This is also true in Washington State. So the majority of people are worried about climate change in Washington State. We also find that generally adults think that global warming is going to actually impact future generations. So we see a pretty strong endorsement of that across the entire country and within Washington State. However, there's something that's really important here, which is that when we look at adults, most adults think that global warming will not harm them personally. So they don't think that they're personally going to be impacted by global warming. So when we go back to the extended parallel process model, in order to have a real threat, you have to actually believe that you're susceptible to a risk, right? So what this data is telling us is that people aren't actually believing that global warming is going to personally impact them. So we see 42% for the United States believe this. And also for Washington State, there's a lot of people who don't believe that this is going to have a personal impact on them. All right. So what about how people view climate change action? So what we can actually do about climate change? Well, most Americans think that there's actually something that we can be done about climate change. So the green is for strongly disagree or somewhat disagree with the statement that it's too late to do anything about climate change. Now, this is a chart that is a pie graph that is looking at people. And what's important here is that the blue slices are people who believe that humans can do something to reduce global warming. So if it's blue, they endorse that idea. If it's red, the brighter red means that humans can't reduce global warming even if it's happening. And the dark red means that people think that global warming isn't happening at all. Okay. Now, for the blue, what's interesting is that there's a fair number of people who think that we could reduce global warming, but that people aren't willing to change their behaviors, so we're not going to. And that's about 25% of the public. 48% of the public think that we can reduce global warming, but it's unclear at this point whether we will actually do what's needed. And it's really only 5% of the public that thinks that humans can reduce global warming and that we're going to do so successfully. So this is really important because, again, going back to the extended parallel process model, you not only have to believe that there's a threat, you also have to have efficacy. You have to believe that you can make change and that if you make changes, it will make a difference, right? So here we want to believe that both humans can reduce global warming and that we are going to do it. So there's real room for changing these views among the public. So there's some good news. It seems like adults actually generally do recognize that the environment is important. So 70% of adults actually prioritize the environment over the economy, for example. And that's true in Washington State as well. There's also, interestingly, a lot of interest, and in fact, bipartisan interest, in doing work to address pollution. And there's a range of different ways that this could be used. And when you look across Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, there's actually a fair amount of support for certain types of actions, like investing in renewable energy. Large majorities agree with that across those groups. Regulating pollution is quite popular as well. Taxing pollution is somewhat less popular among Republicans. Again, taxes, but there still are a fair amount of support across these groups for engaging in these types of activities. Now, other types of action are individual action, and this is not talking about larger societal action. This is actually people doing things themselves. And here we see that there's a big issue across the country that people don't really talk about climate change, even though it's a real big issue. So for a lot of people, a very large proportion of people report that they very rarely report or talk about climate change with other people. This is also quite true in Washington State as well. So it's not as much of a topic of conversation as it might very well need to be for us to actually effectively engage with this. And this gets back again to the extended parallel process model. We have to raise awareness to the extent that people actually are willing to start talking about and engaging with this issue. There's also the fact that a lot of people aren't hearing about engaging or hearing about climate change in the way that's impacting people as much as they probably should. So this is a percent of people who hear about global warming in the media at least once per week, right? So to some extent, those messages aren't getting across. And that's also true in Washington State. So another thing when we think about action, how people respond to action, as I've mentioned early on in terms of change, a big factor in terms of change is social factors, right? So what do people think the norms are for their communities? So injunctive norms are what people that they care about, what people they appreciate, what they think of those others think about taking action about climate change. And the descriptive norms are what people actually believe other people are actually doing, right? So what are their actual actions, all right? So here we see the injunctive and the descriptive norms. So we find that for some people, so the question on the top bar is, how important is it to your family and friends that you take action to reduce global warming? And we find that less than half of people feel like their friends and family really want them to do something about this, okay? And if they felt that there was more pressure, there's good research suggesting that people will be more motivated to do something. Down at the bottom is looking at descriptive norms. And the question here is, how much of an effort do your family and friends make to reduce global warming? So this is just describing how much your friends are actually doing. And here again, we see a minority of the population saying that the people that care about are making a moderate amount or more of effort to actually do something. So there's a lot of room for improvement here, and the shifting these conversations to create more social pressure towards engaging in this issue could make a difference here as well. So I just want to say some things about intention. So these attitudes that we've talked about actually predict whether or not someone intends to act. But they aren't everything related to whether people intend to act. So intentions account for about 25% of someone's probability of acting. All right. So if you measure people's attitudes, it doesn't perfectly predict whether or not they'll do something, but it does have some predictive capacity for them. However, the remaining 70% are largely more background factors, right? So, something about, their culture or some other element. What we found is that the most important, probably the primary background predictor of action related to climate change and impact on climate change is actually socioeconomic status. So lower income folks have a much lower impact on climate change than higher income folks. Higher income folks are using much more resources generally and causing a much higher impact on climate change. So that's just an important thing to understand about those individual relationships. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the Six Americas. And this is some research. This is based off research done by the Yale Climate Change Group and George Mason Climate Change Group that are really focusing on communication and understanding and public opinion around climate change. So first off, let me explain what they're trying to do with this. So the Six Americas is an attempt to segment the population to understand how different groups of people behave differently. All right. Now, population segmentation is where you take a population, you break it apart based upon different characteristics. It could be beliefs about different things, but very often in research we use different demographic factors like age or socioeconomic status or religion or other factors like that, right? Now, the important thing about population segmentation is that when you're talking to somebody about climate change risks, it's really important to talk directly to people in their own identities and focus in on specific populations because different populations have different needs and tend to have different characteristics. Sometimes in health practice, we just use generic messages that are supposed to reach everybody. The problem is that when we write these generic messages, very often a message that talks to everyone effectively talks to no one. And what I mean by that is when things are so broad and generic, people tend not to really care about them and they tend to not pay a lot of attention to those messages. Ideally, you want communication to actually be tailored to people's particular needs, interests, and desires and attitudes, right? And in order to do that customization, you actually have to understand the characteristics of the people that you're talking to and trying to change. So you need to be able to identify which group of people you want to talk to, given whatever goal you're trying to achieve for health or climate change objectives, and then tailor that message to them specifically. All right, so what did this group do to try and do this? So they created a lot of different surveys. They have about 36 survey questions to try and segment the population. And what the type of segmentation that they're doing is really around beliefs around climate change. Now, what they did is they actually narrowed down that 36 questions to just 4 questions that they found to actually be pretty effective at segmenting the population into different groups based upon their beliefs. So this isn't going to be perfect, but it does give you a general idea of what you're grouping the people you're talking to think. So the first question is, how important is the issue of global warming to you personally? From extremely important to not at all important. The second question is, how worried are you about global warming? From very worried to not worried. And then how much do you think global warming will harm you personally? From a great deal to I don't know. And then how much do you think global warming will harm future generations of people? From a great deal to don't know. All right. So those are the 4 questions that they ask people. And based upon those questions, they separate them out into groups. And the groups that they came up with there's 6 of them, which they're referring to as the 6 Americas, the 6 general groupings of people. So the first group is people who are alarmed about climate change. They believe it's happening. They're concerned about the health impacts, and they're actually really scared about it. And they're actually already very often doing something to try and act to address this concern. The next group is the concerned population. So concerned people are worried about this. They are still learning, but they're definitely engaging with it, and they're certainly thinking about what types of things they want to do to try and address this issue. Now, then there's the cautious group. So the cautious group here is ones that kind of they're not really paying a lot of attention, but they're kind of a little concerned. They're thinking about it. They have some awareness of it perhaps, but they're not really very engaged, and they're not really doing anything about it or planning anything about it. The next group is people who are disengaged, and these are people who just are checked out around climate change. They're really not paying attention to it. They're not listening to the news. They're just doing their thing and plugging away. And they don't really have opinions really one way or another. All right. Then you have people who are doubtful. And these are people who are sort of lightly skeptical around climate change. They kind of doubt it. They're the people who, when you talk about climate change, but it happens to be a cold day, they're saying, well, it's cold today, therefore we don't really have climate change. So they're skeptical, and they don't tend to really believe in it very much. And then there's another group, which is people who are actively dismissive. And these are people who really fairly actively oppose the idea that there's climate change. They think that it's actually a hoax. They think that it's something that isn't real, and that we should really be going full bore in terms of pursuing economic activities that are pretty environmentally destructive from a carbon emissions perspective. All right. So if you take this measure and you apply it to the general public, what you'll see is actually that you have a breakdown where the majority of America, United States, people in the United States actually fall into the alarmed and concerned category. So that is actually the majority of people in the United States. You have about 16% that are cautious, maybe thinking about this a little bit. And then you have 7% that are disengaged, are not really thinking about this. The doubtful and dismissive group is, at this point, a smaller group, but it is a significant group. So it's about 20% of the population. So if you look at down below, the people who are more alarmed and concerned generally have the highest belief in global warming. They're most concerned and they're most motivated to do something, whereas the dismissive and doubtful have the lowest belief in global warming and least concerned and least motivated. So what are we seeing about the trends if we look at this over time? Well, this is looking from 2014 to 2019. And what we see is that there's actually a growing portion of the population that is alarmed and concerned. And compared to 2014, the alarmed group has actually grown the fastest. So it's about 21% higher just in that period of time, 5 years, than it was initially. So people are increasingly alarmed and concerned about climate change. So that's good news that there's actually increase in motivation to do something here. Now, it's helpful to kind of look at this breakdown in terms of understanding the population. So some things to know about the alarmed and concerned category. Well, they tend to be really involved in the issue. They're not really as flexible, so it'd be hard to convince them. They're not willing to think that climate change isn't occurring. They believe in this, so they're not going back and forth on this issue. They tend to use news quite a lot, and they tend to be scientifically informed about climate change. They also tend to accept science, so they believe the scientific reports, and they tend to look for scientific consensus. And overall, they tend to be scared and looking for solutions. Now, the cautious and disengaged group tend to be uninvolved, and they tend to not really be thinking about it and not really addressing it. They are more flexible in that they can go back and forth on climate change issues depending on messaging. So they are a group where there's a lot of potentially to move them into the alarmed and concerned category. They tend not to use media as much, or especially news sources, and they tend to not see climate change as relevant. They don't think it's a real threat, or they don't think that they have anything that they can do about it. And what's really important when you're talking to them and helping them is that it's important when you raise awareness of this risk that you also pair it with solutions. Because they're uninvolved, they can get scared away really fast. So they need to know that there's something that they can do when you're looking at that risk and efficacy relationship. Now, for the population that's doubtful or dismissive, what's interesting is that they actually tend to be involved. They just tend to be involved in opposing changes related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So they're working against efforts to actually do something about this. In fact, people who are dismissive tend to be almost as involved as people who are alarmed. They're really pushing in the opposite direction. Like people who are alarmed, they're also less flexible. It's much harder to get them to change their point of view. They actually do get a lot of news, but their news tends to be from sources that tend not to take science very seriously and tend to engage in things like motivated reasoning, where the information that's provided is red herrings or assembled to support this view that climate change is not happening or is not something to worry about. There's also a tendency in these groups to pay attention to conspiracy theories that, this is just a political hoax or ploy to gain political advantage, right? Now, when we're working with that group, they are hard to work with around this issue, but they tend to respond to communication around values that include their values, right? So to the extent that one can connect with what they want or what they think, sometimes that can build a bridge to them taking climate change seriously. So I think it's helpful to think about what our opportunities are for working with people who are doubtful or dismissive or in those categories. So first off, I would just say sometimes this debate gets really polarized, and the focus is on, we forget about the fact that the vast majority of the population, about 80%, doesn't fall into this group. And these are people who already believe in this or who, are cautious or, disengaged, right? So those are people who we have real potential to work with and actually start engaging with mitigation and adaptation efforts. So we don't necessarily have to focus all our attention on working with people who are deny climate change, right? So in some senses, having these hard debates with a group who typically has pretty hardline views that are hard to shift may actually be effort that might be better spent with other groups, right? But we also don't want to totally disengage from that conversation. And I think that it's important to recognize that people come from different backgrounds and that it's actually understandable for people to have these beliefs, given that the people that they trust and care about in their political party and in their communities really don't believe in climate change. And, while I would say that there might be advantages to focusing on the 80% that has potential, that is easier to get to act on this, I also don't want to give up entirely on the idea that we can use the best information possible to actually work with people around coming together around this issue so that we can get past this partisan perspective on this. So there has been some research on how to work across this divide. And there's a few things that have shown some success. So the first thing is sort of framing. So how do we talk about this? Can we talk about this using terminology and frames that is more valued by people who fall into doubtful and dismissive category? And again, this gets into sort of partisan perspectives. So here we could talk about patriotism, right? Is it patriotic to support our country by helping us address this real threat to the country? Can we do things around conservation and sustainable energy that allows us to have energy independence from other countries where we import oil? Can we think about individualism in a way that we support people's right to make decisions, but that we help encourage them to make decisions that support addressing climate change? Also, for people in the doubtful and dismissive category, they seem to actually be pretty responsive to questions around health. They do care about health and health of their families and communities, and they want this can be a way of connecting with folks in those groupings who oppose the idea of climate change. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that people in the doubtful, and particularly people in the dismissive category, tend to be very concerned about emergency preparedness. In fact, people who are dismissive are just as likely to be engaging in actions around emergency preparedness as people who are alarmed, right? So in some ways, a lot of things that we worry about in terms of adaptation and emergency preparedness, you potentially could create collaborations across partisan divides that don't even mention the word climate change. Who says that when you try and do an adaptive thing that you have to talk about climate change? Maybe you can talk about climate change you can do things that advance our ability to deal with emergencies that don't talk about climate change at all. The other thing that is kind of interesting is that when it comes to values, values are very much segmented along party lines. Now, here's 5 different values. One is values around dealing with and addressing and considering harm and risk. Another is around fairness, so vulnerable populations and those types of concerns, so justice and fairness. Another is loyalty, so loyalty to one another, respect and respect for authority, and purity, so purity of spirit or otherwise, right? So what's interesting is that among people in the liberal part of the population, they focus almost entirely on harm and fairness. That's the frame and the values that they tend to talk about and focus in on. However, people in the doubtful and dismissive category and on the political right tend to use actually all of those 5 value categories. So they tend to use them pretty equally. So when we're talking about climate change, we can also use values around loyalty to one's family and community, respect for the needs of the United States, and perhaps bringing in conservative leaders who actually acknowledge climate change. So there's how can we talk about respect in a way that is respecting our land, etc., and thinking about purity, that we don't want to have polluted streams and polluted air and things like that. Can we use that value terminology to build connections there as well? The other thing is to think about solutions that actually match preferred approaches. So, Republican approaches tend to focus on market solutions to these problems, whereas the political left often focus on regulation and other types of governmental solutions and taxation type solutions. So what's worth considering is that there are multiple ways to address climate change. And when we're working across groups, can we consider whether there's ways that can make everybody happy in terms of addressing these problems? Because there are plenty of ways that there can be market-based solutions to some of these problems. All right, so what about people who are concerned or disengaged? So these are groups that are generally harder to reach because they tend to not be as involved in sort of news and the conversations around this. So it's a little bit harder to reach them, so you often have to have better communications, very often simpler communications that are really tailored, designed to like raise interest and awareness. One thing that you can do with this population is also called inoculation strategies. So if they're sort of on the fence about climate change one way or the other, you can inoculate them against misinformation, right? So again, there is that political divide around this climate change conversation, and being able to say to them, look, about 97% of scientists actually believe that climate change is occurring, and then also telling them that there's misinformation campaigns that are there are campaigns, for example, there's an online survey where people can just enter into a petition which says that they're scientists and that they think that climate change isn't real. And there's about 30 people who signed that, but there's no, if you tell people, well, it turns out that anybody can sign up for that and they can say that they have a degree as a scientist, and there's no confirmation that they're actually scientists. And there's no confirmation that they're actually scientists who know anything about climate change, right? So this can inoculate people to those messages. So if someone comes and says to them, well, there's 30,000 scientists who say that climate change isn't real, well, they already know that that isn't good information, okay? So that can be helpful in these populations. It's also important to know that people who are concerned and disengaged, they use different processes for thinking about risk and information. So when we talk about risk, we talked about that sort of just general idea versus a verbatim understanding of things, where we're looking at data and having numerical understandings of things. Well, concerned and disengaged folks tend to really use that more just heuristic thinking, where we're not going and rationally thinking through things carefully using numbers and science. It tends to be more like, who do the people like? Do they like the messages that they're seeing? Are they delivered by people that they find attractive, right? Do they feel related to that person? Do they feel like they connect with that person, like that person is like them? Do they think that that person is credible, that they have experience or knowledge that they trust? Is it something fun? Is it humorous and enjoyable? And do they hear it a lot? And does it have that impact of seeing it multiple times, right? And expressed in multiple ways, right? So this type of heuristic thinking tends to be used by that population. So sometimes it becomes much more important to design communication strategies that are really focused around the liking element to things, or credibility or humor, to get those people to pay attention. Now, I've mentioned before, and this is particularly important to people who are going into the health professions, is that health is actually a real angle that makes a difference across the 6 Americas, right? These 6 categories. So across the 6 categories, everybody cares about health. Everybody cares about their health. Everybody cares about the health of their family and the health of their community. And this really makes the health-related issues of climate change a really useful piece of information. So generally, the public has relatively little knowledge about the health impact of climate change. They don't think about it, and they also don't recognize that there's certain populations that are vulnerable. In fact, if you ask someone off the top of their head to name one health impact of climate change, only 25% of the population can name anything. And the thing that they can typically name is respiratory type problems, right? But we know that there's many other types of health problems that are of concern, right? So this is an area where there's a lot of potential for raising awareness. Now, the level to which people recognize that there's health impacts of climate change really varies across the 6 Americas, from the alarm having a pretty good awareness of health impacts to people who are dismissive having the lowest awareness of health impacts. So that gives a lot of potential to raise across these different groupings an understanding of this. And even among the alarm category, there's a lot of room for improvement. Okay, So when we're thinking about designing communication campaigns for the public, there's a few things that have been shown to actually help make a communication campaign work. So the first is that you want whatever you're saying to somebody, to the public about climate change, to be simple. So focusing in on a key point or key idea, really making sure that the key idea is emphasized. So if the key idea is that um, we need to drive our cars less, you really need to talk about that and really focus on, transportation change and not confuse it with lots of other climate change issues. So you'll want to mix in, change in distribution of infectious disease with car transportation because it's going to become too much, right? The other thing is that you want your message to be unexpected. You want to use novel ideas or surprise, right? Do something that people wouldn't expect, where they're curious, where they're wondering what's going on. You can ask them questions, right? People like questions because it engages them in terms of thinking, oh, what's going on here, right? So this level of unexpectedness is a good way of raising interest and attention. Another thing is making it concrete. So you don't want sort of elaborate, complex messaging that talks about lots of different things and is abstract. You want to be clear about what you want. So if you're talking about the ways that cars increase carbon emissions, you want to make it clear you want people to drive less, or you want them to use public transportation, or you want them to buy electric cars, whatever it happens to be. Make it clear what you want and make it that message come through. And don't bury the lead, essentially. Okay. The other thing is credibility. So people, as we talked about before, people respond very differently to different people based upon whether they trust them. Different groups have a lot of faith. So politicians actually, sometimes they're popular for certain groups, but they often have limited credibility. One thing that's really interesting is that healthcare providers have actually really high credibility. People in public health, people in the medical professions, nurses, have high levels of trust, and people pay attention when they're the people who deliver messages. The other thing that's interesting about this is people think that healthcare providers are credible across the entire 6 Americas. So that's true across those groupings, political groupings. So that also makes healthcare providers really important. But other credible people might be people who've actually been impacted by climate change issues, or people who are respected by that community, right? Another thing that's been shown to make a difference is to really do things in a message that engage with people's emotions. People don't entirely function as computers, where they rationally look at science and they think about things and then they make a decision. People actually use emotions quite a bit in terms of helping guide them towards engaging in change and helping them pay attention to messages that they're perceiving. So when you see a message from someone who has been harmed by climate change, who has had their house lost because of flooding, that people have sympathy and emotions that are evoked from this. And this also relates to stories. People really like stories. They like those personal stories. They pay attention to personal stories with a narrative that pulls them in terms of thinking about this, because it helps them to imagine themselves in a situation and to make this real. And again, when we come back to the idea around the extended parallel process model of how people engage in change, that perceived threat, and the efficacy, using these different strategies are much more likely to help people to actually know what to do, to pay attention, to believe that to have some sense of threat, that this is a risk, and to actually engage in that pathway where they actually make a change to decrease their risk and decrease population risk from climate change. All right. So that's a rundown on communication theory. A lot of this information I've talked about here is actually applicable not just to climate change, it's applicable to general health related threats. But it is a useful framework for thinking about how are we going to talk to people about this. It's a complex issue. It's a very partisan issue. But you know what? Everybody's going to be impacted on this regardless of the party. So we really have to be able to engage with people, connect with people, and help move this conversation forward to proactively and effectively address climate change in a way that helps protect the public from the risks that we're anticipating coming forward. All right, so I hope that that was interesting for you. So take care and be well, everyone.